John Parker had always been a man of discipline and focus. As a professional MMA fighter, he had spent years honing his body and mind, learning to control aggression and channel it with precision. But nothing had prepared him for the subtle, creeping dread he felt when it came to his son, Ethan. Life in their suburban neighborhood had seemed peaceful enough: tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and a quiet homeowners association that appeared committed to maintaining order. Yet, lately, John noticed changes in Ethan: hesitation when talking about school, quiet withdrawal during meals, and a shadow of anxiety that clung to him. At first, John chalked it up to typical childhood stress. He remembered his own struggles growing up and thought maybe Ethan simply needed reassurance. But as the days went by, the signs became impossible to ignore. One morning, Ethan lingered too long over his backpack, fiddling nervously with the straps, eyes darting toward the window as if expecting someone to appear. John's instincts, sharpened by years in the octagon, told him something was off. He began observing more closely, asking casual questions about Ethan's day, and paying attention to interactions at school drop-offs and events. What he discovered was disturbing. Certain parents, all influential in the HOA, seemed to relish minor conflicts, treating children's mistakes like opportunities to assert dominance. Ethan had become an unspoken target. John felt a knot tighten in his chest, protective instincts igniting, a familiar fire that warned him a storm was coming. Despite his concern, John remained calm and analytical. He knew that rushing in without understanding the situation could backfire, leaving Ethan more vulnerable. So he watched, gathering clues, piecing together the pattern of intimidation. He learned which parents influenced which teachers, which kids followed the HOA parents' lead, and how the dynamics at school created an environment where bullying could thrive unchecked. At home, John created a safe space for Ethan, trying to coax him into opening up. He shared stories of his own childhood, carefully planting the idea that problems could be solved with strategy, patience, and, if necessary, force, but only as a last resort. He reminded Ethan that bravery was not about fighting, it was about standing up for oneself and others when it mattered most. By the end of the week, John's unease had transformed into a quiet determination. He could feel it in his bones: the delicate balance of their lives was about to shatter. The calm before the storm was over. Something had to be done, and he would be the one to do it. The truth hit John Parker like a sucker punch one Friday afternoon. He had returned home from work to find Ethan slouched on the couch, fingers nervously twisting the hem of his shirt. Something was wrong. The boy's usual chatter about school and video games had evaporated. "Dad, I don't want to go tomorrow," Ethan muttered, barely looking up. John knelt beside him, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Talk to me, Ethan. What's going on?" At first, Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the window as though the very walls might betray him. Then the story spilled out, small details at first, about teasing and pranks, but soon escalating to the full scope of the torment. A group of students had been systematically targeting him for weeks. They mocked him in class, tripped him in the hallways, and left cruel notes in his locker. What made it worse was that the bullying wasn't random, it was orchestrated by parents involved in the HOA. These adults had created a toxic chain of influence, teaching their children to exploit the powerless, and Ethan had become their latest target. John's heart pounded with a mix of rage and fear. He could see the fear etched into Ethan's eyes, the way he flinched at every creak of the floorboards. He wanted to explode, to storm the school and demand justice, but his MMA training kicked in, forcing him to breathe, to think strategically. He knew that acting impulsively could make things worse, potentially putting Ethan in more danger. Over the next few days, John began quietly investigating. He observed the schoolyard, noting which children clustered together and how the HOA parents subtly encouraged them. He reached out to teachers, presenting questions with careful neutrality, yet every effort was met with vague reassurances or outright dismissals. "Kids will be kids," one principal told him. "It's nothing serious." John knew better. The bruises Ethan had been hiding under his sleeves, the whispered insults, the growing anxiety, they were serious. One afternoon, John saw it firsthand. While dropping Ethan off, he watched as a group of children cornered him against a wall, shoving him roughly while laughing. One of the parents, standing nearby with a smirk, made no move to intervene. John's fists clenched at his sides, But he forced himself to stay calm, committing every detail to memory: the names, the faces, the exact moments when the bullying escalated. By the end of the week, John had enough evidence to confirm what he had feared: this wasn't isolated. It was systematic. The HOA's toxic influence had poisoned Ethan's school experience, and no one in authority seemed willing to stop it. For the first time in weeks, John allowed himself to feel pure anger, not reckless, but focused, dangerous in the way only a trained fighter's anger could be. Protecting his son was no longer a suggestion. It was a mission. The situation reached its tipping point on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Ethan returned home from school with his backpack torn, sleeves ripped, and a bruise forming on his forearm. His eyes, usually so bright and curious, were clouded with fear and shame. John Parker's heart sank as he examined the damage, feeling a surge of helplessness he hadn't experienced since the first day he stepped into the MMA cage. "What happened, Ethan?" John asked, his voice calm but steady, a dangerous edge lurking beneath the surface. They cornered me again. In the hallway. They pushed me, and the teacher didn't do anything," Ethan stammered, tears welling in his eyes. They said it's because you fight. That I should be like my dad and fight back. I can't." John's jaw tightened. The layered cruelty of the HOA parents had reached a new depth. They weren't just encouraging the kids, they were manipulating the system, teaching a message of power through fear. The thought of his son suffering, helpless, under their influence, ignited a controlled fury within him. This wasn't a fight in a gym anymore. This was personal, and the stakes were far higher. He tried every official route: first emails, calls, formal complaints to the school, even meetings with the HOA board. Each attempt ended in bureaucratic indifference, excuses, or outright hostility. "Kids will be kids," they said. "Don't overreact." But John knew overreacting wasn't the problem, inaction was. Every day that passed without intervention left Ethan vulnerable to further physical and emotional harm. John realized he had to act, but he also understood that his action needed precision. Years of MMA had taught him discipline. Emotion without control was dangerous, both for him and for Ethan. He began documenting every instance: photos of bruises, videos of interactions, notes on conversations with parents and teachers. At the same time, he trained with renewed intensity, running drills that honed not just his body but his ability to respond quickly and decisively. At night, he and Ethan spoke openly about boundaries, safety, and courage. John emphasized that fighting was a last resort, but when someone targeted their family with malicious intent, sometimes boundaries needed to be enforced directly. "You'll never have to fight them," he reassured Ethan, "because I will. But you need to know I'm ready. And that's enough for you to feel safe." The culmination of frustration, fear, and righteous anger set the stage for an inevitable confrontation. John felt the tension coiling in his muscles, the mental clarity that only comes when every detail is considered and every possible outcome visualized. The breaking point had arrived, passive measures had failed, and the time for controlled, decisive action was at hand. For John Parker, the father and fighter, there was no turning back. Protecting his son was no longer negotiable, it was mission critical. The school's annual spring fair was supposed to be a light-hearted event: booths, games, and laughter filling the otherwise quiet suburban campus. But for John Parker, it was the perfect opportunity to confront the source of Ethan's torment. He arrived early, scanning the grounds with a trained fighter's precision. He wasn't there to intimidate casually, he was there to protect his son and make it unmistakably clear that the bullying would end. As soon as the bullies and their enablers appeared, John noticed the smug looks on their faces, the same ones Ethan had described for weeks. They were gathered near the snack stand, whispering and laughing, clearly feeling untouchable under the halo of the HOA's influence. John's pulse was steady, every muscle tensed, but his demeanor remained calm, almost detached. He approached deliberately, ensuring that Ethan stayed safely behind him. "Hey, Ethan's had enough," John said, his voice low but firm, catching the attention of both kids and parents. The bully scoffed, assuming his warning was just a bluff. The parents, influential HOA members, moved to intervene or perhaps to assert their own superiority. They didn't know the kind of man they were facing. In seconds, John had positioned himself strategically, his movements precise and controlled, demonstrating the efficiency of someone trained in martial arts. The first bully lunged, trying to assert dominance through aggression, but John sidestepped and restrained him with a technique that neutralized the threat without causing lasting harm. Shock rippled through the group, the parents' faces drained of color. No one expected such composure coupled with decisive action. The confrontation escalated quickly, but John maintained control. Each move was calculated to subdue, not punish recklessly. When another parent tried to step in, he intercepted with authority, making it clear that the rules of engagement were no longer theirs to dictate. By the time the chaos subsided, several of the bullies were on the ground, safely restrained, and their enabler parents were facing the humiliating reality of being powerless in front of a crowd of witnesses. Spectators, other parents, teachers, even some of the older students watched in stunned silence. What could have been a reckless brawl turned into a display of disciplined force, every action measured, every outcome controlled. John made sure Ethan stayed in the background, safe and unharmed. The message was unmistakable: no child would be bullied under his watch, and no adult could manipulate or intimidate him or his family with impunity. After the confrontation, John calmly collected Ethan, who was trembling but safe, and walked away. The bullies and their enablers were left to deal with the immediate consequences, facing embarrassment, scrutiny from other parents, and eventual administrative action. For John, the moment wasn't about glory, it was about protection, about reclaiming safety for his son. In the days following the confrontation at the school fair, the neighborhood and school community were buzzing with whispers and speculation. The HOA, previously untouchable in their circle of influence, suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Parents who had once flaunted their power were confronted with uncomfortable questions from teachers, administrators, and other families. The bullies, stripped of their sense of entitlement, faced disciplinary measures for the first time, and the ripple effect of John Parker's decisive actions became impossible to ignore. Ethan, for the first time in months, felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. Walking into school the next week, he noticed that the sneers and whispers had vanished. Some of the other children, who had once hesitated to intervene, now approached him with cautious friendliness. The environment was not perfect, but the fear that had shadowed him for so long had begun to dissipate. Ethan's confidence started to rebuild, not because the bullying had been magically erased, but because he knew his father had his back, and that knowledge gave him courage. For John, the aftermath was a complex mix of relief, pride, and reflection. He had acted decisively to protect his son, but he also understood the fine line he had walked between justice and vengeance. MMA had taught him control, but even so, he recognized the potential consequences of his actions. Legal repercussions, community gossip, and personal scrutiny were all possibilities, yet he never regretted stepping in. The greater risk was leaving Ethan exposed to continued harm, and that was a risk he refused to take. In private moments, John reflected on the lessons the ordeal had taught him. He realized that strength was not just about physical ability, but about courage, discipline, and the willingness to act when others fail. He had protected Ethan not with reckless force, but with careful strategy and unwavering resolve. The experience reinforced the bond between father and son, a trust built on the assurance that, no matter the circumstances, John would always be there to shield his child from harm. The HOA, chastened and wary, began to lose its iron grip over the neighborhood, and the ripple effects of accountability continued. Families who had remained silent for years started to speak up against minor abuses of power. John's actions became a whispered cautionary tale, a story of a father who refused to let bureaucracy and entitlement dictate the safety of his child. Ultimately, the story was not just about a fight, it was about courage, love, and the protective instinct of a parent. John Parker had confronted a system that failed his son, and in doing so, he had reshaped the rules in his own household and, perhaps, the wider community. He had proven that sometimes, when institutions fail, it falls to individuals to act decisively.